بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. A very emotive topic for many different types of people, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. Something that divides opinions, divides peoples, divides ideas, divides even the people who make up policies and make up views with regards to the issue. And I sat down to think about this talk, and I thought, what's my opening line going to be? What famous quote can I find from Umar ibn al-Khattab or the Prophet ﷺ? What ayah could I open with to start discussing this issue of defending Masjid Al Aqsa? And I found one, and I thought it's quite apt because it's going to be one we're all going to know and we're all going to understand. All of you seen Kingdom of Heaven, yeah? And you see at the end when the Muslims are pounding the Jerusalem, if you remember, with Salahuddin on the outside, and then Balian and the Christians are on the inside, and they're basically trying to hold out against the Muslims, and the wall finally collapses in the west, and then they basically say, okay, we've got no choice but to go out and to make agreements and make terms with the Muslims. So Balian comes out and he meets Salahuddin, and they agree terms of ceasefire. And then Balian turns around and says to Salahuddin, what's so important? And at which, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, he turns around and he says, nothing. And at that point, Balian's confused. He said, after all that, you waged war on us for all these years, and you said, it's not that important. And then he turns around after that and then he says, everything. And I think, although not a direct quote from history, it's a Hollywood line and it sounds nice, but it's something that really evokes that feeling of, what this prize, this jewel on the Nile, this place called Palestine, what it actually means to Muslims. It is everything. It's the place where Muslims have dreamt about and have thought about. It's that which drove people like Khalid bin Walid forward with the armies to liberate this land and to implement Islam over. It was the prize that Umar ibn al-Khattab, he took with him, and he goes down in history as the Khalifa who conquered this land at the time. And it's for this reason why we know this person called Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. May Allah be pleased with all of these people. And what we're talking about, this land of Palestine, it's not just another piece of land. It's not just in Iraq, not to belittle Iraq. And it's not in Afghanistan to belittle Afghanistan. And it's not a Pakistan to belittle Pakistan. And nor is it a King's Cross to belittle King's Cross. This land we are talking about is somewhat fundamentally different from all of these other lands. And that's one thing we need to bear in mind. We are not talking about a normal piece of land somewhere in the world. We are not talking about a name that belongs to a piece of land and an island or a border that surrounds a piece of land that people call it something. If you was to think about the importance and the significance, then the easiest equation I can make in my own mind, what would you do today? And how would you feel today if I was to tell you that Masjid al-Haram was being occupied by the Zionists? That is the significance of this discussion. That we are talking about somewhere that Allah has protected and Allah has made a place for worship for Muslims is under the occupation of these Zionist Jews today. And we know this, and we know the significance of this land. And I'm sure there's plenty of talks out there that describes what the importance of Palestine is. But very briefly, we know that this is the land that the Prophet ﷺ, he done wal Isra wal Mi'raj. We know this miracle night journey where he went from his place in Mecca and he travelled to Jerusalem. And then from Jerusalem, Allah he ascended up to the heavens to receive revelation during the night of Ramadan, during one of the nights of Ramadan, the Wal Isra wal Mi'raj. We know this is the mosque, Masjid Al Aqsa, where the Prophet ﷺ, he led the other Anbiya in Salah. We know Masjid Al Aqsa was the first place where Muslims prayed to. Now the qibla in Mecca, that wasn't the first mosque Muslims used to pray to. Muslims actually used to pray towards Jerusalem, Al Aqsa Mosque. And in fact in Medina there's a mosque and it's called Masjid Al Qiblatain. For those of you that have been Hajj, or those of you that have been Umrah, you often go to visit this mosque as part of your ziyarah. And why is it called the Masjid Al-Qiblatain? It's the Masjid of two Qiblas. Because normally when you go in a mosque, there's normally a front, and at the front you have the mihrab, isn't it? Or the mimbar, where the imam stands. But this is the only mosque where you actually have two mimbars and two mihrabs. Why? Because there was the mimbar that used to point towards Jerusalem, Al Aqsa. And then there's a second mimbar when the Muslims receive revelation to turn and to point towards Makkah. So this is the significance of Palestine in the eyes of Muslims. That this is the place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had designated to be the first place of prostration, the first direction of qibla. That Muslims would pray towards this area. We know that this land is a land of prophets. It's the land of Anbiya. You think about all the prophets that have come through history. Read about the prophets that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us and informs us about in the many ayats of the Quran. What land did they come in? Where did they live? Where did they give their message to? And you find a great deal of these prophets were in this area called Palestine. And in fact, you go to this region today, you find many of the graveyards, many of the qabrs, where these prophets are buried. So there's one Masjid Al-Ibrahimi, where Ibrahim ﷺ is buried. So this is the significance of this land. We're not talking about another Iraq or another Palestine. We are talking about land that Allah has blessed. Land that Allah has made different to all other lands. And to give you an illustration of this, the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, he talked about the one who prays in Masjid Al-Haram. He gets how many rewards? He gets 1,000 times more reward than 100,000 times more reward than he would do in his normal prayer. And then the one who visits Masjid Al-Nabawi, the Prophet's mosque in Medina, it's 10,000 times more reward. And then the person who prays in Masjid Al Aqsa, his salah is worth 1,000 times more than his prayer anywhere else. It's one of the few places where Muslims are actually encouraged to go and visit. The Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith that you shouldn't travel to visit another mosque except for Masjid Al-Haram, Masjid Al-Nabawi or Masjid Al Aqsa. It's the mosque that the Prophet ﷺ specifically said to Muslims, we shouldn't visit any other mosque except to visit one of these three mosques. So that is the context of this discussion, what we're talking about Palestine, or occupied Palestine. It's not just another land. But today what do we find in Palestine? Do we find the Muslims and the Palestinians living as free Muslims? What we find is that this is the same land that's been occupied by the Zionist Jew. This mosque which we worship, this mosque which we used to face towards, and this mosque that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made sacred, we find the Zionists are actually trying to destabilize this mosque. They're trying to dig tunnels underneath this mosque to find something called a temple that used to belong to King Solomon. So they're trying to excavate under this mosque, and by excavating under this mosque, what's going to happen to the mosque above it? So they're trying to dig tunnels underneath the mosque, and what that's doing, imagine you had a house and you're trying to dig a tunnel underneath the house, but you don't put up proper foundations. What happens to that house? It's going to collapse. And this is what they're trying to do to this mosque. This is the mosque that you're not actually allowed to go and visit if you're below 50. If you go there, if you speak to the people there, you have to be above 50 if you even want to go and pray in there. And this isn't a rule from Islam, this isn't Muslims that are stopping you from going to pray in this mosque. It's who? It's the Zionist Jews that are stopping you from doing this. And we saw last year what happened. I'm sure we all remember the Gaza war. The 21 days, I think it was, from the end of December to the middle of January. What did we see? We see this Zionist military machine bombing and pounding and killing innocent civilians, using things like depleted uranium and white phosphor. That's now causing many, babies being born deformed. Babies being born without proper limbs. Babies being born with all sorts of complications. People suffering from things like leukemia and cancer because of these these radioactive materials they used during this campaign. What else do we see? It's just on this issue of what's happening to Masjid Al Aqsa. Do you guys remember back in the 90s there was a masjid in India called the Barbary Masjid? Some of you might not remember, but it's worth going back and doing a quick search to the Barbary Masjid and what happened in India. And here was another masjid that the Hindus said that there was actually a Hindu temple, a Hindu monument that was more important underneath this mosque. And what happened? You actually find the Hindus went over to this mosque